Yeah. Okay, welcome everybody. This is very exciting. I have been pushing this off for some time, but the time has come. We are now here. We are going to be learning the practice of Tanya. This actually was a gift given to me by a friend of ours, Avram Markovich. Actually, he started Positive Judaism. So he had given me this book, I would say almost about a year ago. And it's been sitting in my closet. And I kept saying, yes, I'm going to learn it. But now we are finally here. And as I started to sit down, my son is like, how are you going to learn this? I'm like, well, I have the Practical Tanya. And he's like, do you have the map of Tanya? So I have this as well. And this is from Shais Taub, and I've been listening to many of his classes. And for those of you who are in the 5 towns, you may have heard some of his classes. So a lot of these teachings have been taught to me through him. And also with reading this book and listening to a lot of shiurim. And this is kind of something that we're going to do together. So welcome everybody. Everything here will be saved on Instagram and also be put into a podcast. And let's get started. So tonight's going to be kind of like an intro. We're going to get through maybe the first actual chunk of Tanya. If anybody has any questions at the end of class, I'm always going to put it out there for questions. And if anybody wants to message me, you can reach me through Instagram Live or through my own personal Instagram, and we can learn this together. So really, actually, I wanted to learn this with a harusa, with one person, but I wasn't sure who was going to come on here with me. So if somebody wants to come on here and learn it with me, we can definitely do that as well. Okay, so we'll get started. I personally did not grow up Lubavitch or Chabad. Only later on, actually, in my lifetime, have I been exposed to Chabad Hasidus. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I want to say it was about 8 years ago. We were going through something in our life. We were in the middle of moving, and my husband was leaving his job and starting another job, and we just moved into the house, and it was a very overwhelming time in my life. And I do remember standing in a certain area of my house and just crying. And my husband looked at me and he's like, do you want to go to the aisle, to the Lubavitcher Rebbe? And I was like, what? I don't do this stuff. I've been to Israel and I go to the Kosel. And I know that my sister-in-law, Chumi, she's a big fan and she would always go. So I was like, oh, she goes, maybe this is something I should entertain. It was just I needed a place to daven. I needed to just talk to Hashem. And the moment I got there, it felt like I was in Eretz Yisrael. I don't know, I can't explain it. I lived 15 minutes from the OL or the aisle. And we just got in the car and it was so easy. And okay, for those of you who've been there, the cookies, and they have very good milk, and they have snack machines. And I didn't even know what I was doing, honestly, the first time. I just came in there. I didn't even write a kfitzel. I didn't write a letter. I just went straight to daven. And immediately I felt wow, this is where I feel like my tefillos can go up. So I started going whenever I felt the need to, whether it was before Shabbos, or it was a hard night, or it was after work. And I just started to go a lot. And then about 5 years ago, when my daughter was born, she had a lot of complications with her health after she was born, and it was related to feeding. And anytime I was going to a doctor with her, or anytime we had to we had an appointment, somehow the OL was always on the way. It's it's on the highway. You know how Rachel Imenu was buried on the side of the road? So the Rebbe specifically asked to be buried on the side of the road, near the airport, so that people could go daven. And I just found myself going all the time, coming out there with my Duna, my baby, who weighed 6 pounds at the time, just going there, davening there, taking her to the next appointment, going back, and it just felt so normal. It started to become a normal thing for me that whenever I need to daven or on my way to the doctor's appointment, just hoping that everything goes okay with her, I would just go and stop there and daven. And I would naturally, I would take her out, and it was just, for me, it was a very, it was a special time within my life. Right now I can say special. At that point it was probably very hard. I think about it and it was still very hard, but for something about it was just very comforting when I came to the OL. And then a few years later, 2 years later, we were going to get a bracha from the Mezbezher Rebbe, Rabbi Rosenbaum, and he sees women. So I went in with my husband and the kids, and we walked into the room, and immediately, like, he looked at my husband, he looked at me, and he said, "Oh, your wife is Lubavitch." So I was like, "No, my family is like Monkach, like I'm not Lubavitch." And then he was like, looked at me, and he was like, "Your wife has a connection with the Lubavitch Rebbe." So I was like, okay. I'm like, I go to the aisle a lot. And he looked at me and he said, "You should go also when it's good." And it hit me like, I felt like at that point in my life, I needed to pray for something, I needed to daven for something. So I was like seeking out, and I like kept going, and I was davening there and just like hoping that my tefillos got answered. And when things got a little bit better, like I just kind of like pulled back, and it wasn't as like necessary for me. And it hit me to think like, no, you should go also when it's good. Like the Rebbe hears us all like crying and complaining and kvetching about our problems. Like he wants us to come back and say things are good, and just also to daven when it's good. So since then, I've been going, like, I try to go at least once a week. And like I have a friend of mine, Michelle, who's always like, "Faigy, like, do you have any other date nights other than going to cemeteries?" And I'm like, this is just kind of where I feel comfortable. So I've been going there. I go a lot. I started to learn a little bit more about the Rebbe, not just as a place for me to daven. And I started to learn about writing kitlach, and writing letters and the meaning behind it. And it's very, very powerful. And every time I'm there, they sell like books there. And I pick up like children's books for my daughter. And then they also had a book about the Rebbe. And then there was also the Practical Tanya. And I'm like, I kind of like, I need to start learning this. Like, if this is where I'm going and I'm finding like solace and comfort and a place to daven and like a makom kavu, whether I feel like I can daven and my tefillos are answered, I really need to be learning a little bit more about this Hasidus. So that's kind of where my journey began. There are those who've been learning Tanya since they're young, and it was like a little daunting for me to like do this, because I'm like, I did not grow up like learning this. But you know what? Like I heard recently on a podcast that the Rebbe always said, if you know Aleph, then teach Aleph. And if you know one concept in Tanya and you feel like you want to teach that, then go ahead and teach that. And like, the truth is that for me, it's like a little bit selfish, because like as I get to teach it, I get to learn from it also, but you guys are all here along the way. So I'm very excited about this. So tonight, what we're going to try to do is using this map of Tanya, which is really, really incredible by Shay's Tao, just to outline what we'll try to do tonight. Is he really kind of breaks up the chapters, and I'll explain to you a little bit about the Baal Tanya, who is the author of this book, and why he decided to write this book. And really, when it comes to understanding this book, you have to really understand that like it's a book of Hasidus. And what Hasidus is essentially is the mystical parts of Torah, like the deep, esoteric secrets of the Torah, referred to as, let's say, sometimes it's Kabbalah, or it was brought to us from the Zohar, where we can take these concepts and we can apply it into our daily life. So bottom line, we just want to be good people, and we want to be good mommies, and we want to be supportive parents and good coworkers and good friends. And for us to learn the practicalities of Hasidus through the mystical topics, it's so exciting for me. It's like every day I can like attach myself to like one concept of Tanya, and then already I can start, to feel a little bit better about myself, but also to push me through the day and to build me and to grow me stronger. So just a little bit about this book. This book was written by the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe is known as the Baal Tanya, as he wrote this book. But we refer to him as the Alter Rebbe. He was the one who founded the Chabad Hasidus. He was a student originally where Hasidus began with the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov had a main student named the Maggid of Mizrich, and one of the main students of the Maggid was the Baal Tanya. And when the Maggid was nifter, not only did he didn't stop learning, he also started learning with the Maggid's son, and he gained a lot of knowledge from the Maggid and the Maggid's son, and he therefore wrote this book. So what was this book? Was that at a certain point when he became the Rebbe, like Chabad Rebbe, Chabad, by the way, stands for Chachma, Bina, Das. When he became the first Rebbe, there were a lot of people who would approach him, and they wanted to speak with him, what we refer to in Hasidus as Yechidus, that you go in with the Rebbe and you could ask him anything that you want, any shalos, and any questions. And he found himself constantly repeating himself, and sometimes even the same person would come back with the same question, and he found that he didn't have the time for it. So what he did was he put down every question, and he thought people have come to him and foreseen, the foreseeable future questions that we're going to have, that he was going to have, he put them all down in here. So essentially, when you are learning this book, you are kind of having like a one-on-one with the Rebbe, with the Alter Rebbe, and breaking it down. You'll see as you get through the book, he tries eventually to answer all the questions of why we're here, and and teach it through mysticism, through Kabbalah, through this book. Okay. So if you do have this incredible map of the Tanya, he maps out that the first 8 chapters are the spiritual composition of the Jew. So in order for us today, we're just literally gonna wet our palates on the concept of the neshamos and the beginning, like the first concepts of Tanya. So he explains that before outlining the goals and the methods in the service of God, Tanya first defines the spiritual makeup of the Jew in the context of good and evil in this world. And this discussion begins with an analysis of a passage in the Talmud that describes that the neshama took an oath before it came down into this world. So in order for us to understand all of Tanya, we must understand the first 8 chapters. So it's kind of like these are the bullet points for us to be able to understand from 8 and on, because I'm pretty sure it's like 53 chapters. So we have to understand 1 through 8 like solidly and understand the terms, and then we'll be able to go ahead with understanding Tanya and how to incorporate it in our life. So I'm really going to be reading from the book. If anybody does want a copy of this book, The Practical Tanya, we can link it after class, and we'll start with Parak Aleph. Like the Rebbe said, if you know Aleph, you teach Aleph. So he explains in the first chapter, am I good or bad? So he explains that when the neshama, before it comes down into this world, it kind of was asked to take an oath, whether you are going to be, when you come down to this world, you are going to be a tzaddik and not a rasha. Okay, so tzaddik and not a rasha. I think for us, like we always hear the concept like tzaddik, like every yid's a big tzaddik. Like what does it mean to be a tzaddik versus a rasha? So the idea with a tzaddik being a righteous person, like sometimes we think like, oh, my kid did something good. Oh, you're such a tzaddik, right? Like what does it actually mean to be a tzaddik, and what does it actually mean to be a rasha? So in order for us to understand what a tzaddik is not just, we always say, is a righteous person. But what is a righteous person? It means someone who has perfect insights. It means that someone that not only, like anytime they have an impulse or think that they want to do something, they act upon those impulses in a holy way, which is incredible. Sometimes I have impulses and I'm not so happy about it, right? Like I just went to go clean up my kitchen, and in my sink I see a broken glass and something, right? Like my automatic impulse is like, who used the sink glass, right? Like what happened over here, right? So that wouldn't be the tzaddik of me. The tzaddik is seeing something, feeling something, but not necessarily these impulses that they have are only holy. Versus a rasha, or somebody who doesn't have control of his behavior, somebody who loses it, it doesn't matter how often that they do it, but no matter what, they act upon their feelings wrongly, and it's not a good thing. You don't want to be there. So now we have these two sides. We have a tzaddik, an extremely, extremely holy person, and then we have a rasha who's an extremely, extremely negative person. And then what we find in Tanya here is that there's this character that we refer to as the Benoni, which is the person who's in between. Now, what is a Benoni? A lot of times we hear this word Benoni like Rosh Hashanah time, right? Like you're saying you're not a righteous person, you're not totally perfect, and you're not a rasha, you're not a terrible person, you're a Benoni. So Benoni is a very big word. And by the way, another name for Tanya is actually the book for in-betweeners, the Sefer HaBenoni. So what does it mean to be a Benoni? Does that mean that like some of my impulses are good and some of them are bad? So the way that he explains it in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains that a Benoni is somebody who has the impulses of a rasha, but acts upon those impulses like a tzaddik. So we all have those feelings of like, who broke the glass, who spilled the milk on the kitchen floor, all these like negative thoughts and impulses that we want to jump to. But if we can control ourselves and keep those impulses, those rasha-like impulses in control, like a tzaddik does, that's what makes us a Benoni. So all of us, listening here and reading this book and studying and learning this, all of us here are Beinonim. We all have those impulses, but we're able to control them. And the more you control them, the more tzaddik like you are. So it's like, how do I become a tzaddik? I keep refining myself to the point where all my impulses are now holy. So now let's understand chapter 1. So a soul comes down to this world. We promise we're going to be good, right? Like I promise, pinky promise, I'm going down to this world. I'm going to be a good boy. Now, what happens to our soul when it comes down to this world? So here's an interesting concept. And this is the first chapter of Tanya. We have two souls. The first soul, which we refer to here in Tanya as the Nefesh HaBahamis, or the animal soul, is what's given to us first. When we descend into this world, when our neshama says, we're going to be good boys, right? We're going to be good boys and girls. We're going to come down to this world. We are given what we refer to as this animal soul. Think about it for a second. An animal, right? What is an animal? What's it when it comes down to this world? The first thing from the moment it gets here, all it wants to do is survive and take care of itself and self-preservation and feed itself and give itself food when it needs food and relieve itself when it needs the bathroom. It doesn't necessarily care about intellect. It doesn't necessarily compare, not so much about our emotions or our decision making. It's very much about survival. How am I going to live? How am I going to survive? How am I going to get my next meal? Who's going to feed me? Who's going to change me? Who's going to take care of me? Very similar to a baby, right? A baby doesn't care if he wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning and is hungry, right? You know, he just will scream on top of his lungs until somebody comes to feed him or somebody comes to change him or somebody, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's 2 a.m., 3 a.m., middle of the day. It's only caring about this animalistic part of itself that wants to survive, that wants to procreate, right? Like think survival of the fittest, right? It just wants to be able, it's not evil, by the way. It's not evil. Sometimes we think our Nefesh Bahamis, it only wants like animalistic things. No, it wants to be here and it wants to thrive and it wants to live, but it wants to survive. And that is driven by this animalistic soul. So it's very, very selfish. Not only a baby, by the way. Sometimes it's teenagers, right? They're very, very selfish. They're not evil. It just wants to feel good. So that's the first soul. The first soul that we are introduced to when we are born, what we're created with, is this Nefesh HaBahamis. That's the beginning of our life. That's survival. That's just taking care of me. The second soul is really the opposite. What's the second soul? The second soul is a neshama that we refer to in the Baal Tanya as the Nefesh Elokis, which is the godly soul. And when does that enter our body? So as the age, for girls, it's at the age of 12 at bat mitzvah. And for boys, it's at bar mitzvah. Okay, yes, girls receive this nefesh elokis just a drop earlier, right? And that's a whole different worldview. And all that neshama wants to do is it's like the opposite of the animal. So all it wants to do is become one with Hashem. It just wants to go back to Hashem. It wants to go back to its creator. It wants to be one with God. And it's like the total opposite. The animal soul is like, feed me, feed me, feed me. And the nefesh elokis is like, just leave me, let me be, like, I don't want to have any attachment to this physical world. I just want to do what I can to get back to being one with God. So if the Nefesh Bahamis is all about survival, the Nefesh Elokis is all about self-annihilation. I don't want to have anything to do. And what we see is that these two souls are kind of like, actually like, they're constantly at each other's heads because all it wants to do is take care of itself, and this one just wants nothing to do with itself. So they're total opposites, and now they're both placed within one body. So here we are. Dilemma number 1 is that we have two souls, and they're constantly fighting over each other. They're constantly fighting at each other. You know, we can think about this when I was talking to my daughter, who she makes up a lot of stories these days. She's 5, and I know this is normal. She was telling me about the parsha this week, and I'm like, oh no, she's in camp. There's no way they're learning like actual parsha. They're probably just like learning about Shabbat or B'Tamas. But she was like, yeah, and then they had twins. And I'm like, who had twins? And she's like, Yaakov had twins. I'm like, oh wait, Yitzchak had twins. She's like, yeah, Yitzchak had twins, right? And you start to realize that the story of Rivka and her twins of Esav and Yaakov, right? I'm like, oh, that's where she's getting at. I'm like, that's not this week's parsha. But maybe if you're listening to this during Parshas Toldos, this is your parsha. But she was totally like talking all about these twins, and I'm thinking Esav and Yaakov are like the epitome of they're like the personas of these two souls. Where you have Esav, who's just like, feed me, like Halitani mate, right? Like all he wanted was food, feed me. I don't care about the Bechorah, I don't care about anything else. All I want to do is take care of myself and feed myself. He was a hunter. And then we have Yaakov, who wanted nothing but himself, and just to like obliterate into one and be one with Hashem. Yaakov Ishtam, right? Yoshev Olam. He was in the Oel. He was just learning in the Oel. He was there learning all the time, and that's kind of the Nefesh Elokis. So you have these two within one. Now, when Rivka went to Shem Aver to find out what was going on within her, right? Remember, she was having these like crazy pains and feelings within her stomach, where she would walk past like a house of idols, and she would feel kicking, and then she would walk past the shul, and then she would feel kicking, and she was like, what is going on inside of me? And she was told, Shnei Goyim v'Vnech, you have twins within you. You have two different kingdoms inside of you. And then once she heard that, she was totally fine. Not that she didn't care that, like, oh my gosh, she's going to have a son who's going to worship idols, but she understood and she grasped this concept that there's two within her. That's kind of how we have to view ourselves. Not in a bipolar way, but in a way that we have animalistic instincts built within us. And then we also have godly instincts within us. So it's okay if one day all you want to do is like learn Tanya and go to the aisle and to daven and learn. And then you have other days where you're doing errands and like you're feeding and you're stocking your fridge and you're like, today's Trader Joe's day, right? Like it's okay to have those feelings. Now, the question arises is who is going to be in control? You can have days and moments where you feel your animalistic soul is ruling over you, and then you could have moments where you feel your nefesh halokis is ruling over you, right? Like, what do we do on Yom Kippur, right? The concept of Yom Kippur is to remove yourself from physicality, remove yourself from the nefesh of Bahamas, so that you can connect to your nefesh halokis, your godly soul, and you can elevate yourself, and you can feel one with God, and then you could daven, and you could ask for mechila, right? We don't do those days very often. We do more days of eating than we actually do of fasting. So what does Tanya teach us about these two souls? What is the purpose of these two souls that we have within us? Are we supposed to be like Rivka? We're supposed to be battling them all the time? The concept is that what this book wants to teach us is how do you, as a Benoni, right? How do you, as an in-between person, take all your animal instincts that you have, that you were given at birth, that you're used to, and they're primal, and they're everything that you need to survive, and then how do you mesh that with your nefesh halokis, with your godly soul that you're given later on in life? What is the purpose of this? How do we get these two in sync working? Otherwise, you would wake up every single day literally in turmoil with like these two nations kicking with inside of you. So what Tanya teaches us, and this is really what it promises over here, is that as we mature and as we get older, what we need to do is we need to make sure that the nefesh halokis is always sitting in the driver's seat. The actual car, the makeup of the car, and the engine, and the wheel, and the seat warmers, that's all the nefesh Bahamas. That's all part of you. It's all the vehicle to get you where you need to be. But who is in the driver's seat? Who's the one who's running the show? And that is the nefesh halokis. And the more that we keep the godly soul in the driver's seat, with the GPS, with the Waze on, the more control we'll have of the animalistic soul. And we have to keep in mind that the animalistic soul is not that, it's not evil, and it's not dangerous, and it's not out there to get us. It's just the other side. And a way that the Tanya explains it is a word, it's a Kabbalistic word, it's the word of the Sitra Achra, which is the other side. A lot of times we like to think that the bad side, like the animalistic side, looks just like Esav, right? Like we have this like little devil that pops up, right? And really it's like a mini Esav, right? Esav was born like redheaded, hairy, probably with a pitchfork and like a thing to go hunting, right? Like a hunting stick. He embodies that Nefesh HaBahamas. And by the way, it says that Yitzchak loved Esav. Like, I was always like so confused. Like, why did Yitzchak love Esav? Like, how did he not see? Because he saw the potential that Esav had. He saw within him all this energy for survival, and he saw that he had real kachas, and he just wished that those were to be harnessed. The problem is that Esav detached himself and didn't want anything to do with Yaakov. Had they worked together in sync, it would have been, like Mashiach did. But they didn't. So that's an example of the animal soul and the godly soul separating. But having them work together is the purpose and is the goal of living our life and seeing our animalistic traits and then using our godly soul to put him in the front seat, let him drive, let him hold the reins. Shays Tao gave an incredible example, and I think he said he was writing a children's book, and I'm sure at this point it's out, where like you can see the Nefesh Bahamas as like an ox, right? It's somebody who's very, very strong and is able to drive you and pull you places. But you just have to make sure that he's in the right place at the right time to drive you there. Okay, so he's the horse, you're the one sitting in the chariot holding the reins, and then who controls who? That's the idea between the Nefesh Elokis and the Nefesh Bahamas. So that's what we learn in chapter 1 and chapter 2. The tzaddik is somebody who has only a nefesh elokis, and the rasha is somebody who only activates the part of his nefesh habahamis. But the Beinoni is the one who takes the nefesh elokis, puts it in the driver's seat, and lets the animal soul drive it where it needs to go. Okay. What's amazing about this nefesh elokis that we have that enters our body as we get older and more mature at 12 and 13, and by the way, that's why we're only really held accountable for mitzvos and punishment once we get to bar and bar mitzvah age, is that you start to realize that all these things that the nefesh elokis wants is how I really, really want to live my life. The nefesh elokis is what gives me connection to my children, to my coworkers, to my parents, to my family. It's that spiritual desire that we want. It wants to take everything that it sees here in this world, and it wants to just connect it back to Hashem. It wants to be like, okay, I'm in this situation. Okay, I'm in traffic. Okay, why am I in traffic? Okay, I'm in traffic because somebody was, rubbernecking over there. Somebody pulled over. Somebody got into an accident. That's why there's traffic. No. The Nefesh Elokis says, no, you're in traffic because you need to be in this exact spot at this exact time right now, because somehow whatever's happening is connecting you back to Hashem. So what you start to realize is all the Nefesh Elokis wants to do is take whatever's there, whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, whether it's an argument with your teenager or your spouse or your coworker, any argument, any good thing, any bad thing, and it wants to just bring it back and say, wait, why is this happening to me? Every single moment that I have with parenting, with cooking, with shopping, is a godly experience. And we do this, like for some things it's so easy. Like for Shabbos, it's so easy, right? You're like, okay, I pick up this meat, l'kavod Shabbos Kodesh, right? Now I made challah, l'kavod Shabbos Kodesh. I am making sourdough again this week, even though I burnt myself, l'kavod Shabbos Kodesh, whatever it is. Everything that we do in this world and we give meaning to it is feeding your nefesh elokis. So you can't just feed your nefesh habahamis with food, and your animal soul needs food, and it needs exercise, and it needs whole wheat cookies, it needs all that healthy stuff. Your neshama also needs to, and your godly soul. And how does your godly soul do that? By taking everything and bringing it back to God. I'm not just taking care of my kids, I'm taking care of the children of Hashem. I'm not just, feeding my kids supper again. I'm doing this, I'm feeding Hashem's children, and then they have the strength, and then they can go learn, and then it starts to make you think before every little thing happens, and it's really, really incredible. So its primal desire is to return back to Hashem, to return back to God, and even if that means, by the way, totally losing your soul, totally losing yourself. If you can think of an example, I know we have some people on now, if you can think of an example of somebody who is able to totally feed its nefesh elokis, its godly soul, so much to the point that it went back to Hashem, who was that person? Let me see if anybody here can answer. That person was Rabbi Akiva. Right? Rabbi Akiva is somebody who, at a certain point of his life, he gave up everything. He even gave up his life to surrender to Hashem. So God gave us 613 mitzvos, right? Hashem says, here's the mitzvos. This is the rule book. This is your path. This is your GPS for both your animal soul and your godly soul. And when you connect that godly soul to your animal soul, that's bringing into the perfection of the Benoni, right? Because the Benoni is not necessarily a perfect person, right? The Benoni is somebody who has instincts but doesn't act upon them. And how do you control from acting upon your animal soul? You remind yourself that you have a godly soul, and that godly soul is there to not only to perpetuate your life, intellectually and learn Torah, but also to always connect everything back to Hashem. That's all it wants to do. So now, these concepts are obviously very lofty and very big, and we're going to try to chunk them up into smaller pieces so that it's something that you can hold on to. But what I want to explain, one thing is that as these souls descend into this world, we're made up of different parts. Even though we're really all one body, we have different parts. So within, when the body when the neshama descends into this body, it descends with what we refer to as kohos, which are in Hebrew sometimes we say kohos are strengths, but it's kind of like the reflection of the spheros of Hashem. So I'll explain it like this. When Hashem wants to manifest itself in this world, he has many different traits, okay? And we refer to them as spheros, okay? So like different attributes of God, if you want to say, where God can act with intellect and with kindness and restriction, and in Hebrew we refer to it as chesed and gevura and hod, yisod, malchus. Hashem descends, when he brings the souls down into this world, the genetic makeup of the souls are mirroring God's. So God's are what we refer to as spheros, but within us they're referred to as kohos. So we have these abilities of Chachma, Bina, Das. We have them built into us through God, when he created us. And both our animal soul and our godly soul have the same kohos. The question is, what is its root desire? So what we'll try to do next week is try to understand a little bit more about these two souls, this animal soul and this godly soul. And we'll try to explain how to utilize those two souls at the right time. Okay, so thank you very much for joining. Like I said, everything will be saved and recorded here on Instagram, and also be made up into a podcast. And if you have any questions, please feel free to message me. Thank you so much for joining.